My name is Joyce, and this channel is Medusa was found. You can find more of my work at unguruyourlife.com, a private business club, research team, and lifestyle ensemble. Hi guys, this is Joyce. Thank you so much for joining me at Medusa Was Framed. Tonight I have for you one of my Reset Architect installments. This time we're going to look at some of the buildings on Jekyll Island. Now, of course, we know Jekyll Island is very famous for the site of the creation of the Federal Reserve, amongst other things. There are numerous resources if you would like to learn more specifically about that, as well as the influence of all of the industrialists and robber barons and the in-depth ties connecting all of this to the Titanic, J.P. Morgan, and the first transcontinental phone call. I am going to touch on these things only as a point of timeline reference, but that's not the focus of this video tonight. There is so much on all of that, and some of it is absolutely fantastic. My first reference to you would be The Creature from Jekyll Island, the book, which I will show an image of later. So let's get started. Most noted for the secret meeting place for the formation of the Federal Reserve, Jekyll Island's history stems back of thousands of years into sophisticated technology and earth-building civilizations of the Mississippian indigenous. That golf course by your house is most likely a Mississippian geotechnology example of Antiquitech. And don't believe for 1 minute that the finders who put their name on it don't know how to use the elements of that Antiquitech. They always have, they continue to do so, and they probably are now, even if it's just collecting your plasma as you hit balls and walk around on their predetermined paths. The key finders and funders of this story unraveling around us had elaborate homes they called cottages in the colony here. Their collection of architects to build and enhance residences, golf course, and landscape read like a soap opera at this point in my exploration of reset architects. In the 1580s, the Spanish were setting up missions all along the U.S. Atlantic coast, specifically in what we now call South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, most especially the Channel Islands running along the barrier of the southeast Atlantic coast. The indigenous the Spanish found upon arrival have become known as the Gullah, ancestors of the modern Gullah Geechee people in South Carolina and Georgia, and the Timucua in South Georgia and down into Florida, all Mississippian shell ring builders and earthen-bound builders, not heathen fishermen. Operating in elaborate chiefdoms similar to our legislature, very successful traders, agriculturalists, and operating within very sophisticated, multi-layered societies. The missionaries settling the Georgia Golden Isles called Jekyll Island Ila les Balanos, Island of Whales, due to the persistence of right whales there. They called the people they found the Macombo, based on a word in their dialect. These people are the ancestors of the tribes now known as the Yamasee in Florida, the Apalachee, also in Florida and into Alabama, and the Timucua, who were here in my town of St. Augustine. Mukambo means of the sea. They were the island dwellers. Jekyll Island sits south of St. Simon's Island and north of Cumberland Island. Jekyll is a 5,700-acre barrier island between salt marsh and the Atlantic Ocean. Development into Georgia was in part a buffer to the English development in the New Carolinas. The British built up Georgia specifically, strategically, and aggressively. In 1733, a known name to anyone in the South, General James Oglethorpe, a Parliament member and officer, brought a shipload of settlers on the ship Anne to the modern-day Savannah. He was given permission by the chief of the Macumbo tribe to settle on a particular bluff. That area became the first gridded development in the United States, Old Town Savannah. Oglethorpe was exercising his experiment in creating a colony that cleaned out debtors' prisons in London. Building his colony, Reformation debtors, as well as a strong military to enforce the perimeters, William Horton was called in from the British military to assist in Fort Frederica on St. Simon's Island. Horton became Oglethorpe's right-hand man. In 1734, Horton arrived in Savannah as Oglethorpe's chief military aide. Major Horton was granted 500 acres to develop on the current Jekyll Island in 1736. Here, he built his home and cattle ranch. The remains of his home is one of the oldest in Georgia. A condition of this land grant from the Crown was bringing 10 indentured servants, one for every 50 acres, and that 20% of this development would be in cultivation within 10 years of the settlement. After 5 years of clearing, he was able to return to England for his wife and family. In 1736, considerably famous but not much documented diplomacy of nations was held on Jekyll Island between Spanish, English, and Creek leaders to work out land, water, and hunting rights. We are to believe that a workable agreement was made. In 1742, after losing the Battle of Bloody Creek on St. Simon's Island, the Spanish retreated from Georgia, passing over Jekyll Island and destroying the entire Horton home and plantation, leaving nothing in their way. In 1747, looking to start anew, Major William Horton is noticed as purchasing a large copper pot to experiment with brewing beer. This became the first brewery in Georgia. In 1749, Horton died. Over the next 40 years, several British land grants were granted. In 1792, the Sapelo Island Company was formed by 4 French landowners with claims to this island land. Christophe Poulain d'Aubignon was one of these men. The Sapelo Land Company, French, purchased by 1800, the d'Aubignon family owned all of Jekyll Island. Oglethorpe had named Georgia in honor of his king, George. Georgia was a colony for all free to worship, and slavery was not allowed. Indentured servitude was seen as not slavery, as a way to clean out jails and help selectively populate the new colony. Jekyll Island was named after Oglethorpe's friend and financier back in London, Joseph Jekyll. Though the English had established a slaveless colony, the French very actively employed them. The War of 1812 changed the land. Plantation and d'Aubignon home burned, and half his slaves left with the British for promised freedom on other colonial islands. The plantation was put up for sale in 1819, but due to the economy, obviously there were no buyers. Christophe de Bourignon died 1825. Then the Civil War brought Sherman to Georgia. On November 1858, during a storm, the cargo ship Wanderer offloaded 500 slaves on Jekyll Island. A congressional action was signed into law by President Thomas Jefferson in 1808, making the transport of African slaves a federally punishable offense, potentially by death. The ship was owned by Savannah businessman Charles Lamar. Scandal broke out in Savannah and neighboring Brunswick, in society strongly reacting to the perpetuation of slavery in this incident. The owner, Charles Lamar, and Captain Martin were tried and found not guilty, but the state's attorney didn't give up. In May of 1860, Charles Lamar and inheriting Dubourignon son, Henry, along with the sailors who had worked on the boat, were found guilty of taking Africans from the Congo to transport for slavery. They were sentenced to death. They were jailed, fined, and paroled. But the Bourignon plantation had come to an end. Henry de Bourignon moved his family to Brunswick on the mainland. In 1863, Henry divided the plantation amongst his 3 sons. His son John saw the potential to develop the land as a hunting resort. His brother-in-law in New York, Newton Finney, was a member of the infamous Union Club. I speak of the Union Club in my video about Stanford White, the scandalous, salacious architect murdered in public in New York City. It was known as the Pedophile Club, the Kink Club. It did not have a good reputation. Lobbying for members and supporters, he secured 53 members for his new venture from the Union Club. These included Marshall Field, J.P. Morgan, John Pulitzer, and William K. Vanderbilt. Finney had been hired in the 1850s as a surveyor for the Union Army to assess the land around Brunswick Creek and all the Channel Islands. So he was very familiar with Jekyll Island and the waterways. In 1885, Finney prepared the Jekyll Island Club Incorporation as a hunting, fishing, yachting, racecourse, golf, and clubhouse resort. 100 shares were issued to 50 people owning 2 shares each. Invitations were issued only to select members to form their board. These members were part of the New York Union Club, the Chicago Club, and selected individuals in Boston, Philadelphia, and San Francisco. Notable members of this first board included Henry Hyde, an American businessman, founder of Equitable Life Insurance. William K. Vanderbilt, well-known businessman, philanthropist, horse breeder, and manager of the family's railroad fortune. Joseph Pulitzer, publisher and namesake of the Pulitzer Prize. And of course, J.P. Morgan, the owner of the company that built the Titanic and the Olympia. The inspiration for the capitalist in the Monopoly game, and Marshall Field of Chicago, the founder of the famous Chicago department store. In 1886, Jekyll Island was sold to the Jekyll Island Club. Between 1879 and 1883, the club was formed. The original clubhouse opened 1888. The first president of the club was Lloyd Aspinwall, a lawyer, Civil War soldier, became Brigadier General of the National Guard. Coming from a family of Episcopalian ministers, his uncle was seated in the U.S. House, and his aunt was married to FDR's grandpa, Isaac Roosevelt. Lloyd was a trustee for the Brooklyn Bridge. He was the co-founder of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a noted member of the New York militia. Lloyd died shortly before the club opened. Judge Henry Ellis Howland, the vice president, became the president. Judge Howland attended Yale, Skull and Bones. The New York Times wrote on April 4th, 1886, of this new association for wealthy gentlemen. The clubhouse was designed by Charles A. Alexander, a member, of course, of the American Institute of Architects, a partner in the firm Alexander and Washburn. He had most conveniently moved to Chicago months before the Great Fire. Alexander and Washburn are noted for the Portland, Maine Sugar House, the Trinity Church in New Haven, Connecticut, the Chestnut Street Methodist Church in Boston, the Boston National Theater, the Revere House Hotel, the Tremont Temple, even though you will find, if you have watched my other Reset Architect videos, that someone else is responsible for Tremont Temple. And what I have found so interesting in looking at these architects involved in the building of Jekyll Island is I can only assume that most people don't look into this very deeply because they can't keep their stories straight. Also attributed to Mr. Alexander is Grace Church in Boston and the Fifth Avenue Hotel in New York City. His job was to build a colony clubhouse that represented a life of elegant leisure. The first golf course was designed in 1898, known as Oleander. 18 holes, 6,521 yards. It was redone in 1964 by the famous Dick Wilson, well known in golf circles, which I am not, as one of the greats, accredited with 60 courses. He's the man who built Doral, Donald Trump's Doral. A member of the American Association of Golf Course Architects. This is something I stumbled upon in an earlier video as well. Why are architects the people who build golf courses? Architects? Wouldn't it be landscape designers or engineers? Architects? Great Dunes was designed in 1926, originally having 18 holes. Only 9 remain because it was built on the dunes of the beach. 3,229 yards remain. The rest has been taken away by Walter Travis, the man attributed with the Walter Travis Society that was formed posthumously in his name in 1999 to promote his legacy of golf course excellence. Walter Travis is attributed with 50 courses. Walter Travis was a golfer. He was not trained as an engineer or an architect or a landscaper. He was a golfer, but he is noted as a turf expert. Pine Lakes was built in 1968 and designed by Clyde Johnson, who was attributed with 70 courses, 18 holes, 6,701 yards. Of his many known courses, perhaps most relevant and most famous would be the golf courses at Myrtle Beach and Hilton Head, part of the Golden Isles. Indian Mound is unofficially the oldest golf course, named because it was built using the Indian Mound. Talk about Loosh collection. It was redesigned in 1975 by the famous Joe Lee, the man famous for the golf courses in Boca Raton, West Palm, Disney World, builder of golf courses for 50 years, 18 holes, 6,000 yards. The landscape architect for the resort was Horace William Cleveland of Grand Rapids. He is famous for designing Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord, Massachusetts, a boulevard system in Omaha, St. Anthony's Park in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the boulevard systems in Providence, Rhode Island. And I ask again, as I have asked in these forays into recent architecture, why do architects design cemeteries? Mr. Cleveland, Unitarian educated in a school organized by his parents, a family socially linked to Ralph Waldo Emerson and the Transcendentalism movement. Initially, he trained to be a railroad surveyor and studied civil engineering. He eventually moved to New Jersey to farm. He became a well-known horticultural educator. Interestingly, he also bid on the Central Park project, but lost to his friend Olmsted. During construction of the Jekyll Island development, he wrote to his colleague Olmsted, and I quote, "It took all the resolution I could muster to traverse on foot and horseback the areas of forest I had to explore, and in spite of every possible precaution, I was bitten and stung from head to foot. I remain determined that the club will possess a style of severe simplicity and remain a natural paradise." Mr. Cleveland was 73 when he was summoned to attend this project. There is a very famous clubhouse, which we will talk more about. But what made Jekyll Island so unique was the cottage culture. Now, in 1947, Georgia took over ownership of Jekyll Island and turned it into a state park, historic district, and club. Those grounds included 240 acres with 34 historical buildings. In 1884, the remaining Dubignon cottage was constructed. It currently sat where Sanssouci Cottage does now. It was moved in 1896, so Sanssouci could be built. Why would they have moved it? The island was undeveloped. We're told it was shored up and mules hauled it over logs to its present location. 50 lots had been set aside for members to build their cottages, most of which have been restored as part of the historical tour. The first constructed cottage, which no longer exists, was built by McEvers Bayard Brown, a New York banker. It was actually built for his wife, who jilted him on the island. He built the cottage, hopped in his yacht, went back to Europe, and continued to pay dues. He encouraged the staff to stay in the cottage when his wife was gone. They did. But the oldest cottage fell into ruin. The second oldest cottage was commissioned by Nathaniel Kellogg Fairbank of Chicago in 1890. He was an industrialist owning soap, baking factories, and meatpacking plants. I wonder if residue from the meatpacking plants went into the soap and baking product. His famous Fairy soap product was purchased by Procter & Gamble. He was the president of the University of Chicago, founder of the Chicago Club, yes, board member, selected, Chicago Club. Fairbank, Arizona is named for him and his Grand Central Mine. The house was demolished in 1944. He was vice president of the Jekyll Island Club for the 88-89 year and remained on the board until his death in 1903. The third oldest cottage is known as Hollybourne, commissioned by Charles Stewart Maurice in 1890, an industrialist from Pennsylvania. The architect was William Day, an Irish gentleman. William Day is noted for designing roads and bridges, as was the owner, Mr. Maurice. It has been restored and is on the tour. The next oldest cottage was known as Solterra, designed for Frederick Baker. I will touch on that later. It burned down and was never restored. The Pulitzer Cottage was built in 1890 by Walter Rogers of Philadelphia, youngest member of the club. He was 26. He was the architect that built his cottage. He sold it to Pulitzer in 1896 after an injury from racquetball. His eye was injured so badly he could no longer draft, he could no longer hunt, He could no longer play sports, so he gave up his commission to the club and his home. It turned into the infirmary in 1930. It's now referred to as the infirmary. Gordon Mackay, the Mackay Cottage, known for creating a sewing patent for boots during the Civil War, commissioned Indian Mound in 1892. In 1904, Rockefeller bought Indian Mound. In 1896, William Struthern commissioned Moss Cottage. George Macy bought the cottage in 1911, a man famous for the Philadelphia Marble Works. 1896, Sans Souci was built, translating to without care. The original site of the Dubignon Mansion Cottage, J.P. Morgan built 24 rooms, 6 apartments. It's noted as the first condominium in the United States. Each floor had 2 apartments. His thought was to build a simpler retreat for groups that would come just with a wife or girlfriend or mistress for a brief stay. Sans Souci was designed by the famous pair of Carrere and Hastings, for whom an extensive video I have made. Carrere and Hastings are known as the men who built Henry Flagler's Florida, certainly Henry Flagler's St. Augustine. The Goodyear Cottage was built in 1906 for Frank Goodyear of Buffalo, New York, a lumber baron, also by John Carrere and Harry Hastings. In 1974, it was restored as the Art Center. Mistletoe was built between 1896 and 1900 by Charles Ailing Gifford, who was hired to build a total of 5 buildings and homes for the club. He, like Carrere and Hastings, had been a junior architect for what was considered the ultimate architectural firm of the Gilded Age, McKim, Mead, and White. Mr. Gifford is known for resorts, also for the New Jersey building at the 1893 White City Exhibition in Chicago and the Louisiana Purchase Exhibition in 1904. He is also noted with designing the Glynn County Courthouse. They can't get their stories straight on so many points with the history of this, because the first mistletoe is attributed to another person, John Craffen, being the Brooklyn merchant who commissioned it, who had negotiated with John de Bignon to open his own club. Henry Kirk Porter was a manufacturer and U.S. Senator, claiming he commissioned Charles Ailing Gifford to redesign it. So, did Gifford design mistletoe? Did Craffen design mistletoe? Your guess is as good as mine. Villa Mariana was constructed in 1928 for Frank Miller Gould, second-generation owner of the railway fortune family Gould, by Danish architect Mogens Dvoud. And this is the only American construction I can find for Mr. Dvoud. Interesting. Rather obscure. In 1927, Via Ospo was constructed for Walter Jennings, a man from San Francisco, eldest of the Stanford Oil co-founders. His maternal aunt was the wife of William Rockefeller. In 1927, Via Ospo was constructed for Walter Jennings, Yale, Skull and Bones. He graduated from Columbia Law School with Teddy Roosevelt. He collaborated with John Russell Popper for this construction. Mr. Jennings was from San Francisco, the National Fuel Gas president. Mr. Jennings was a descendant of Aaron Burr. His architect, John Russell Popper, is attributed with designing the Jefferson Memorial, the National Gallery, Constitution Hall, the National Archives, Temple of Scottish Rite in D.C., and mansions for Vanderbilt, Marshall Field, and the campus plans for Yale and Johns Hopkins. John Russell is also attributed with designing the Washington Square Arch, which I touched on my last video. I can't keep it straight. In 1886, Mr. Alexander was commissioned to design the 60-room Island Club at Jekyll Island. In 1901, an annex was added for the expanding membership. There were 8 suites on the first and second floors. Starting in 1888, members started building their own cottages. In 1898, the first golf course came, along with the marina, swimming pool, tennis courts, bocce courts, and tennis lawns. Scooting ahead to 1986, there was a $20 million renovation. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. The 4-story Clubhouse had an elevator to the 3rd floor. The 4th floor at the time was designed for servants. Due to the popularity of the resort, this changed very quickly, and servants' employee quarters were designed outside. To this day, there is no elevator to the 4th floor. 60 rooms, big dining hall, reading rooms, card and billiard rooms, and a barber shop. Quarters were single and double, with or without bathrooms. Now that brings up another point, with or without bathrooms. Tartaria 101. We are supposed to believe that Henry Flagler, when he built his Ponce de Leon Hotel and Alcazar Hotel here in St. Augustine, built them without bathrooms in the rooms, because we are to believe that at the time, even the elite at this level were not used to the concept of private bathrooms. Both hotels had to be adapted and renovated for bathrooms to be added. The same seems to apply here, leading one perhaps down the consideration of, was it really built when we're told it was built? Was it built to be a hotel, or was it built? In May of 1888, the servant annex was constructed. Richard Ogden was one of the original members, appointed as the supervisor to oversee the initial season, January 1888. It was his job to take care of the removal of wild stallions left from the plantation culture and wild hogs. In 1899, professional hunters were employed to keep the hogs in check and relocate the horses. And open seasons for members was declared for the hogs. He was also responsible for grading roads, draining ponds, and stocking the island with quail and pheasants. It was his job to construct buildings as needed and plant crops for the restaurant. A private train car was available from Brunswick to Atlanta for those who were not in possession of a private car. 200 members, guests, and staff filled the lodge the first season. The Vanderbilts arrived in their private yacht. Buildings that have not survived. Solterra, as I mentioned before, but it has an interesting story. Built in 1899, there were 12 rooms, built by Frederick and Frances Baker of New York City. Frances was one of the only women to become a member in her own right, and had a tremendous effect on the development of the school and art culture on the island. When the Bakers were not on the island, it was made available to President McKinley. Clearly, that became quite a highlight. In 1914, the home burnt down. The Bakers had a portfolio of Manhattan warehouses. Frederick had died the year before. Frances had lost interest and sold the estate to Richard Teller Crane, the Chicago plumbing magnate. In 1917, this location became the Crane Cottage. The dovecote and front planter are all that remain from Solterra. The servant Maggie, who lived on the property year-round, was noted pulling furniture out of the house when it caught on fire. The story around Soltara became a book of a member, June McCash. Her book was called Almost to Eden. In 1901, of course, we know Soltara's most famous guest died when President McKinley was assassinated at the Pan American International Exhibition, subject of my last video. The water tower and windmill were erected in 1891 to replace the low-tech leaky water tanks in the club attic. They survived successfully until in 1896, the largest hurricane in Georgia's history took them out. This hurricane flooded the streets of Brunswick and destroyed a couple cottages as well. In 1901, a dairy was built. The silo is still standing in what is now the forest. The Chicota cottage is a ruin from this hurricane. It was built for Edward Gould. It was designed by architect David King Jr. of New York, noted for the base of the Statue of Liberty, Madison Square Garden, and the Washington Arch. Well, my goodness, Madison Square Garden and the Washington Square Arch. My last video dealing with the architect Stanford White of McKim, Mead, and White is attributed with Madison Square Garden. Not only did he design it, he lived there, and it's where he was murdered. Washington Square Arch is his most famous construction, paired perhaps only with Pennsylvania Station. Someone can't keep their architectural history straight. That's the fourth contradiction I have found. Chicota was known as a casino. Had a swimming pool, indoor tennis courts, a rifle range, a bowling alley, and a big casino room. All that remains are the lions out front. There are brick outlines of many buildings that have been maintained. Green posts cover Jekyll Island, marking old cottages. Joseph Pulitzer's cottage burned in the 1950s. It was beyond repair, and interestingly, the bricks were recycled for the new clubhouses at Great Dunes and Oleander golf courses. The plantation oak is estimated to be 375 years old or more, and the old Shell Road, which was the common route from the club to the beach, still stands. On St. Andrews Beach is the Wanderer Trail Educational Center. Information about the lives of the 500 plus slaves that had spent 6 weeks crossing the ocean in what was one of the last and illegal slave transits into America. There is one significant church on the island, Faith Chapel. It was built in 1904. It was a non-denominational chapel built to replace the tiny room in the French period. Most of the parishioners were Episcopalian in the early days, but increasing membership also brought more faiths. The wife of a member started bringing in various clergy to offer services in different faiths, and this created a movement to build a new chapel. It was, in fact, the bakers of Soltara who suggested the chapel be built. So money was raised to move the small one-room chapel to what was then the black side of town, the servant side of town, Red Row, and the new chapel be built. Why would they move the chapel? Why not just build a new one? What was so unique about that particular piece of land that they had to move a second building? Howard Constable was the architect chosen to build Faith Chapel, inspired by Notre Dame. Howard Constable is known for fire stations. He comes from a family of Quakers and Philadelphia politicians. Original member Frederick Gilbert Byrne, president of the Singer Corporation, died on the island. And in his honor, a window was commissioned from Louis Comfort Tiffany to honor his membership and contribution to the Jekyll Island Club. It now stands in Faith Chapel, known as the Bourne Memorial Window. The Aldrich Bill. So again, simply as a matter of outline and timeline, I will touch upon the Federal Reserve. In 1910, Senator Aldrich was responsible gathering Henry P. Davidson, Benjamin Strong, Frank Vanderclip, Paul Warburg, A. Platt Andrew, and Charles Norton to join him in secret, disguised and anonymously, to form what would become the Aldrich Bill, the plans for the Federal Reserve. These 6 men represented a quarter of the wealth at the time. His bill went to Congress in 1912, but didn't pass. The Federal Reserve Act did pass December 23rd, while most House and Senate members were home for Christmas, 1913. And the first transcontinental phone call occurred on January 25th, 1915, under the supervision of Theodore Vail, the then president of American Telegraph and Telephone. There was a postage stamp commemorating this. Wilson spoke from the White House. J.P. Morgan was there. Thomas Edison was on another phone call elsewhere, all tied in to the Federal Reserve. The club thrived into the 30s, but then there was a depression, and then there was a war. The attempt to open the club occurred in 1942, in January for the season, but it closed early. In 1946, Melvin E. Thompson, on the Georgia Revenue Commission, expressed an interest in buying the island to turn it into a state park. He became governor in 1947 and did. On October 7th, 1947, Georgia bought the island. The Jekyll Island Authority has been in charge of the island since 1950, when it became part of the state park system. In 1954, a new drawbridge was constructed. Presently, over 1,000 people call it home. There are 10 miles of beach. St. Andrew's Beach is noted for bird watching and the Wanderer Experience, an educational program about the lives of the slaves who were released from the Wanderer in the middle of the night in a storm, naked, and Driftwood Beach, known for snorkeling and swimming. In 2007, the Georgia Sea Turtle Island Center was built. As far as restoration goes, we can go all the way back to 1890, when the then members of the club raised the money to restore the Horton House. But in earnest, it began in 1967 and 68, when the Jekyll Island Authority hired J. Everett Farber of Virginia and landscape architect Clermont Lee, a woman, the first woman, in fact, to be licensed by the Board of Georgia Architects, member of National Board of Architects, to develop what came to be referred as Millionaire's Village. This was to be modeled after historical Williamsburg. Mr. Faber was a noted restoration architect, famous in Virginia. During restoration, archaeologists became quickly involved. They found remains of an old pier and indigenous remains going back over 4,000 years before the Spanish arrived. Horton House and most of Millionaire's Village was discovered to be built on significant ruins, along with the golf courses. When digging around where the old post office stood for its restoration, remains of ancient altars were found. Preservationists working the de Bignon estate found graves of Anne and Joseph de Bignon and Félicité. Both were moved into the larger historical walled cemetery. Tim Boone appeared on a radio show with interviewer Rob Scupa and was involved in the archaeology of the altar site. Giant bones were found there. Indigenous people over 8 feet tall. Skeletal remains around the altar site indicate sacrifice, along with illustrations from the time showing sacrifice. I will attach the link to a video about this interview in the comments. It's very interesting. He touches on the consideration that these gentlemen that planned all of this were much more strategic than even just the Federal Reserve, but built all of this on what was known as a Canaanite human sacrificial site. What else is buried beneath all of these structures? We know that Indian Mound Golf Course is all Mississippian mound. It's stated in the history, openly, shamelessly. What's under these mansions? What's under the clubhouse where the Federal Reserve Aldrich bill was crafted? Gives new meaning to why the Dubignon house and the church was moved, doesn't it? Reset architect. Jekyll Island remains a very popular place. Beautiful beaches, much like my St. Augustine here, horse and buggy rides, train tours, history told in a certain way to convey a certain agenda. Lots of people playing golf, following the same predetermined paths. Lots of louche collection on top of at least one human sacrificial altar. I'll let you decide what you think about all this. Thank you for hanging out with me today. This was a different way of looking at Jekyll Island. I hope you enjoyed. I appreciate your comments. This is Joyce at Medusa Was Framed, saying aloha.